I would like to welcome you to the ROC's lecture series first lecture of the year, and a warm welcome to our speaker today, Professor Skúli Skúlason. Skúli is Professor of Evolution and Aquatic Biology at the Department of Aquaculture and Fish Biology at Hólar University and the Icelandic Museum of Natural History, and he is also the chair of BIODICE. So today we will have the pleasure of hearing him talk about diversity of life with specific focus on what is it and why does it matter. Just before we start, just a few words of housekeeping. After Skúli's talk, there will be some time for discussions, and I would love if you would all participate. You are welcome to either speak up or post your question in the chat. I would also like to remind you that the lecture is recorded, but the discussions will not be recorded, and will be able and the lecture will be available at the ROC's website and on the lectures series Facebook page. So please feel free to keep your cameras off during the talk, but in the discussions, it would be great if we turned them on again so we can all feel each other's presence. So now, Skúli, I am delighted to have you with us today, and without further ado, I now hand the virtual microphone over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak in this seminar series, and I'm glad to see all these people. And so the presentation that I have here, of course, has this very sort of grand title, and I'm not going to apologize for it, but but it is, excuse me. But I would like to say that this title is really reflecting a bigger project that involves many people and also connects with my past research and research collaborations in different places, especially with Hólar University, of course, and now with the Museum of Natural History as well. And of course, it's highly motivated by the network BIODICE that I'll introduce at the end of the presentation a little bit more, which concerns itself with Iceland as a special case for biodiversity and basically concern about biodiversity in general. And so if we start with biological diversity and what it is encompassing, of course, life on Earth, we can say that. So it has ultimately extremely important role to play. And this definition, which looks complicated, is the one that is most often used by biologists in particular, coming from Rio Convention 1992. And the main maybe importance of this definition is that it combines diversity of species, of within species diversity, individual diversity and population diversity, such things, and also ecosystem diversity. So it's very comprehensive. But of course, many different definitions are floating around and people are sometimes confused about this complicated subject. But ultimately, the concept of diversity is philosophically and biologically fundamental to our understanding of nature. And it is essential for anything related to ecosystem function. And we know that ecosystem function is the foundation of life on Earth, providing us with the services that we need to promote life. But it also is important for developmental and evolutionary processes that I will be talking about later on. So maybe it sort of culminates in this sentence that without diversity, there are no choices. And if there are no choices, there is no life, there is no nature, really. So, and what motivates maybe us in BIODICE and myself and us to work with this is this very fact, which has been highlighted so much recently, that biodiversity is threatened worldwide. And it's an issue which is very parallel with climate change. And actually the combination of these two has been highlighted. And unfortunately, measures to react to this problem globally and locally have largely failed. And in a recent report by the United Nations, Making Peace with Nature, with this interesting title here, it is highlighted that the problem is really that man is at war with nature. And that needs to stop. So the focus now to fight this issue is to return people's attention to transform its attitude and relationship with nature. And Antonio Guterres says in the introduction of this report, by transforming how we view nature, we can recognize its true value. So to connect this grand statement here with this presentation, I would say that a clear understanding and application of biodiversity concepts is a part of this transformation. And obviously, I'm not going to solve that problem here, but there are several other people working with me that are taking that on, and we hope to contribute more to that as time goes by. But this issue is closely related to what I refer to here as a very common view. The common view is that man and culture, its culture, is separated from nature, that man dominates nature and holds all values and judgments. And basically the arrogance, especially among scientists sometimes, is that there is no mystery in nature, really. There is no complexity, just unknown things to be made known and problems to be solved. So it's a common, and of course this relies in a relatively appropriate, in many cases, metaphor to see nature as a big machine. But this machine metaphor has been taken out of proportions. So it's become much more than a metaphor. This metaphor categorizes things and simplifies things, but has a real problem handling life. So for example, a developing organism is operational and self-constructing throughout its lifetime, but a machine is only operational when it's fully assembled. So let's think about that as a big issue. And this reductionistic view that I've highlighted here, and is very familiar to many of you, of course, is often related to the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century, often connected with the philosopher René Descartes. So what are the consequences for this understanding for biodiversity? It provides a simplified static view of biodiversity. So what we see then typically are that biodiversity is discussed as species diversity, species numbers, or richness of something that people consider important for the work for biodiversity. And it is highly simplified. And this is very evident in all our cultures, in our teaching, in our textbooks, in our policy making, media, and so forth. And another aspect of this view is that there is a unidirectional causation approach. And this is maybe something that we are familiar with, when it comes to gene action, that genes somehow are responsible for setting some kind of causal process, which ultimately explains everything in life. There are some genetic blueprints that explain how organisms operate and how even ecosystems function. And according to this view also, the environment is typically separated from organisms as a separate thing. And the modern synthesis, the most common theory of evolution, which was established in the 20th century, is in fact highly genetically gene-centered and very mechanical. However, this theory has been very successful, so I'm not really downplaying it that way. But there are current theoretical and empirical developments that I'll be talking about later, which are adding to this model of and bringing maybe in a little bit more dynamic process-based perspective. So what basically is the issue that we claim, that are working in this, is that we need a finer scale, dynamic-based and dynamic process-based perspective on biodiversity. And this has been advocated, especially by scientists and scholars, but has only been applied to a very limited extent. And I want to draw your attention to that sometimes I throw in citations, and the citations are really only meant to sort of emphasize certain basic publications that could be relevant for the statements, especially relevant, and you can always contact me afterwards about these references. When I talk about general research findings, for example, from our group, I may not have references, just to tell you how I think about this. So let's then talk about, after coming to this conclusion about process-based diversity, let's consider that diversity as a concept has a very strong philosophical roots. And those roots are really that this is a relational concept. Something is different or changes, diversifies from something else. And if this diversification involves important information like signals and things like that, it can really be important for life to have those differences. So for example, I put in this quotation there, information is a difference that makes a difference. That's a quotation from Gregory Bateson, often used. And for those of you that are familiar with this kind of philosophy, it is based on a phenomenological approach where organisms are really considered to be completely associated, merged with the environment they sense or experience, and then influence also. And my favorite example is really the Umwelt of Jakob von Uexküll, where he sees organisms and life forms in direct connection with their environment, forming kind of a bubble around them. And von Uexküll advanced this. He was a biologist and a philosopher. And so this concept of Umwelt is somewhat similar to the concept of the niche that we are familiar with in ecology. But these relations are really about the relations themselves. So what is not the items that are connected, but it is what happened in between. And that becomes most obvious when we look at signals and signs in nature, which of course are part of this connecting network and the symphony of nature, especially when these signals are interpreted by a receiver, because then some function takes place, some significance, meaning has been created. And this has been advanced by the field of biosemiotics that I just very quickly introduce here in this one sentence. But I draw your attention to a book by Jesper Hoffmeyer on this topic. I would have loved to talk just about this for a whole 40 minutes. But the point is that this whole thing stimulates many ideas about the world, including that the world can be seen in a constant flow and flux, process view rather than substance view. And here, of course, I'm relating directly to the last presentation in Rocks by Ole Martin Sandberg, and we worked together on this, and where he basically stated that Iceland is not a thing, it's a process, a constantly becoming entanglement of interactive differences. Nothing is static, everything changes. It is perfect for process thinking. So this was a perfect introduction for me, because I'll be talking about Iceland later on, but think about this statement, and this is sort of the mantra of my presentation also. And the way we are biologists that have been doing this research and working with this, we sometimes look at this in the context of what we call eco-evo-devo, connecting ecology, evolution, and development. And this framework or a model is kind of used to illustrate these, and it's all about these dynamic relations, interrelatedness, remember, based on this philosophical argument. So if I take you through this very quickly, and now we are talking about, of course, a framework to explain the emergence and persistence of biodiversity in terms of, for example, these phenotypic differences of the beaks of the Darwin's finches that I put here in the middle. So let's just start with the ecological environment, which is responsible for what's called natural selection, where diversity within generations is selected through evolution. But the diversity that is selected is phenotypic variation, which is created within the developmental part. So this is like within generation, population with many individuals that are each of them developing independently. And that phenotypic variation that emerges is being selected. So it's the phenotypic variation, like a group of birds with different shapes of beaks, for example. And then when this evolutionary process takes place, reproduction returns some heritable effects to the next generation, and development of the next generation can start. So clearly genetic and epigenetic, non-genetic factors are being contributed here. But also, the ecological system within each generation is affecting this developmental process through phenotypic plasticity, as it's called. It's basically environmental effects via phenotypic plasticity. And then also, to complete the model, we look at evolutionary changes in the phenotype that occur here as being feeding back or through what we call niche construction, where these effects are affecting the ecological environment. And that can also happen within generations through the devo to eco. So don't worry too much about those details that I've been indicating, but I'll be actually talking much more about development shortly. So maybe pay attention to this emergence of phenotypic differences. But the thing is that this framework is just illustrating like a dynamic, completely dynamic relationship framework, if you like. So and you notice, of course, what I'm drawing your attention to, quite a different approach from the sort of machine thinking. And just very quickly drawing your attention to these two quotations that I'm not going to dwell with in any details, but here we are looking at two very eminent biologists in the 20th century, John Gaylord Simpson and Richard Lewontin, where they really emphasize that organisms are directly connected with the environment they are in. And that is the system that is being selected, as Gaylord Simpson says here. And Lewontin points out that DNA is completely non-functional unless in context of the cell it's operating in. So I sometimes use this picture of the seahorse to make people really realize that you cannot really think of this organism unless in context with its environment. So I would also like to emphasize, according to this way of thinking, it's not in the environment, it's of the environment. And I know this is a lot of points here, but this is mainly just to bring the point home that there's a lot of empirical and theoretical research that is now supporting this kind of model and this kind of relational approach to understanding the evolution and maintenance of biodiversity, including these feedback processes that I've already explained, and its construction, gene regulation processes, which were highlighted after the big human genome project, where it was discovered that it's the context of the function of the gene that really matters. We call it gene regulation. Many of you are familiar also with symbiosis, with the fact that our bodies are full of bacteria that are operating in concert with our trillions of cells. So we are really, if you look inside, a combined organism in many ways. And of course, microorganisms play a big role in ecosystems. Don't forget that. That's also been highlighted. There is great evidence about extended heritability, summarized in this particular book here by Bondurowski and Day. It sort of brings back a little bit of Lamarck, actually. And then finally, which relates to sort of what I'm going to be dwelling more with is the developmental systems approach. That the development of the phenotype is, let's say, based on many interacting things and processes. And what emerges from these developmental systems approach from the data is that there is actually that the variation that emerges is not random. So there is a predictable response in the phenotypic construction that is highlighted by these references. And this has drawn people's attention to the recognition of self-organization and even memory in such systems. Now I'm also talking about ecosystems. That the system itself contains information, memory. Some people would even call it mind, but usually it's called agency. And now I will give you a quotation from a very new paper by Sonia Sultan et al. On this. These are eminent biologists that she's working with. And I know this is a lot of words, but the main thing is that they have a very dynamic, very broad view of a system, how biological systems actually operate, including these developmental aspects that I've already indicated. Coming to the conclusion that biological agency is, in this sense, the capacity of a system to participate in its own persistence, maintenance, and function by regulating its own structures and activities in response to conditions it encounters. So maybe the important thing here about biodiversity is that when we say conditions it encounters, we can be talking about climate change, we can be talking about ocean acidification, various pollution things, for example, just to draw your attention to the importance of these processes. So this notion of agency has become quite well accepted and is becoming much and more. And just to highlight to you one example here, I want to give you an example of plasticity, phenotypic plasticity, the eco-devo connection, where the environment is having direct influence on the development of the organism. And especially this paper here, Fennick et al., is summarizing this phenomena. And if you just look at this picture of the water fleas to the far left, it's a famous example of this kind of plasticity. The chemicals that the water flea during development, these are only a few millimeters long, by the way, is responding to chemicals sensed from the predator. So the organism doesn't see the predator, but senses the chemical and changes its behavior and also changes its shape so that it is less feasible for eating. So it's an adaptive functional response to this signal. So the organism is clearly interpreting the signal that there's a predator in the environment. The signal itself has no meaning. And the same example, similar process would be going on with seasonal color changes in these butterflies, and diet has these effects on the shape of those spadefoot toads. So larvae of frogs, basically. And I have to throw in an example from our own research here from Bjarni Kristjánsson, where he compared plasticity responses in a laboratory in progeny groups of several different populations. Each of these lines represents different populations of dwarfish char that lives in Icelandic springs. And you notice that when they are fed pelagic diet, like up in the water column, versus benthic diet, they do change their shape, but they do it differently across populations, which of course is even more interesting, explaining the evolutionary significance of this also. And I'm introducing the fish here also deliberately because I'll be talking mostly about fish in a moment as examples. That's basically is due to my background and my colleagues. So the conclusion from all of this is really that life is a process, and that this kind of systems approach to life with all these relational processes suggests the worldview that the organism-environment relationship is best seen and studied as an ongoing integrated flow and flux, which senses challenges and opportunities, a creative process, takes form and function in living structures and behaviors. And notice that this view includes that scientists and other humans are part of this process. That is very obvious in ideas that people are writing in this way. So clearly, this is a way to stimulate a process view of biodiversity. And mind you, it's very obvious also that process thinkers do not necessarily want to make life simple. They appreciate the complexities of nature. So they're sort of slightly less reductionistic. Like Whitehead said, seek simplicity, but then reject it. Whitehead was one of these prominent philosophers of process philosophy, as Ole Sandberg explained in his last presentation. So here I switch gears a bit and talk about Iceland and explain how Iceland is a melting pot for evolution of diversity, perfect for process thinking, as Ole said in his quotation that I had earlier. Iceland is a geographically isolated volcanic tectonic island in the middle of the Atlantic, and also quite young time since last glaciation, and that 10,000 years or so, where most life was eradicated. And Iceland is characterized by sharp ecological contrasts among their habitats and also in the ocean currents, the elevation, such things. And because of this short time and geographic isolation, very few species are colonized. And in fact, this cuts across all organisms in Iceland. We have very few species. In the freshwater fish world that I'm going to talk about now, there are, for example, only 5 species, whereas there are 50 species in Scandinavia and 180 species in Canada. And total number of fish species on Earth is probably close to 40,000. So this fact promotes very rapid diversification within species in response to these ecological opportunities that are available, because there is hardly any competition for all these diverse habitats and volcanic and tectonic, all these contrasts that are available for the invading species. So we can say, and now I'm quoting Tom Smith's paper from 1993, that Iceland is really a hot spot for the generation of biodiversity. And he built his research on diversity in ecotone zones in Africa. Remember the interstitials that Ole Sandberg talked about last time, for those of you that were there. Live lurks in the interstitials, said Whitehead. So ironically, of course, I can then state that it's a very cold spot for static species richness. And of course, So here you can see the contrast that I'm drawing up, that if you base your conservation program on counting species, Iceland is worthless. And most of the Arctic is worthless, because many of these things that we see in Iceland are actually available also. We see polymorphic fish like this across the Arctic system. I just don't have time to talk about it here. But many of the things that are special about Iceland are also listed in the manifesto provided by BIODICE on the BIODICE website. So just very quickly, an illustration of the diverse freshwater habitats. Now I'm focusing on these in Iceland. Þingvallavatn, for example, affected by all these tectonic movements. Mývatn here, volcanic, extremely diverse with volcanic caves around where there's small fish living and so forth. So contrasts and differences really all over here. And the example that I take is, of course, very familiar to some of you, is the moors of Arctic char in Þingvallavatn. Þingvallavatn is this large tectonic lake in southwest Iceland. Has only 3 species of fish. If this lake was in Sweden, it would probably have 20 to 25 species. And due to this very little competition, the Arctic char that has come here has evolved in 10,000 years into these 4 different moors or varieties, which have very clear resource-related role. Like you see, their shape of the mouth here is clearly related to their feeding, benthic feeding dwarf, the fish-eating morph, and the planktivore feeding morph. Those are adult sizes, by the way. They are very specialized. They differ in growth patterns, in shape and morphology, and in behavior, diet, and it's all very predictable in the context of the ecosystem of the lake. So this is important. And as I said before, these kinds of polymorphisms, as it's called, are also evident in quite a number of other Nordic fish species like sticklebacks in Iceland and other northern countries. So so notice that here we are talking about within species diversity, very, very distinct. And we are working on a project that Anthony Schultz, working with me here at the Museum of Natural History, is leading, and with collaborators, on basically mapping this kind of interspecific diversity in other Icelandic vertebrate species. We know this is common in sticklebacks and char, but then we also know that there are polymorphism in killwaves that Philippa Samarra is studying, in the Arctic fox, which Esther at the Natural History Institute is studying, and black-tailed godwits that Thomas Gretar Gunnarsson and colleagues are studying, and also in mice that Esther is studying as well, and others. So these are just to give you a glimpse that we, of course, have the idea or feeling and very strong evidence now that this type of within species diversity is much more common in Iceland than just in the freshwater fish. This is something we need to work more on. So how does this then relate to this interrelational framework and explain all this diversity using this framework? Let me just give you a few insights based on some of the research we are doing, and then I will dive more into what I sort of warned you earlier, into the developmental part, to illustrate to you what a developmental system, as an example of a system, process-based system, does. And I'll start just with this relatively simple diagram of our proposal of how evolution of the different morphs in Iceland of char, in this case, has taken place from a single population entering a lake like 10,000 years ago, splitting into 2 resources here, maybe the open water source, pelagic area of the lake, and into a benthic area of the lake, resource B and resource A. And notice that there is talk of selection here. There is talk of no gene flow, because we are proposing that these organisms, these groups, will become reproductively isolated. So it's a process of speciation. That's how we define species. And if we do comparative research across morphs of lakes in Iceland, we do see this kind of continuum. It's like space for time, this is often called. So we would propose that char and Þingvallavatn are becoming very close to be called species, according to this definition. This is based on genetic research, and I forgot to say it when I introduced the morphs. This is very, very important. That genetic research has verified that morphs, when we see them in Icelandic lakes, are most often formed within the lake. We look at this from relatedness. So they're actually formed because of forces operating in the lake, notice. But then, so if we think about the triangle model here, we can say that different factors in here are operating differently at different stages of divergence. So plasticity, we believe, and we have lots of evidence for it, that plasticity is very important here in the early stages, especially plasticity and behavior. But then heritable differences among those morphs become much more evident as this reproductive isolation grows. Obviously oversimplifying things, but also pay attention to the fact that each of these morphs start to influence their environment, their ecosystem dramatically, obviously, by feeding on certain things and really being top predators in their ecosystem. Another example is research from Bjarni Kristjánsson and Kalina Kapralova, where they studied this evolution of these dwarfish population of char. I already told you, notice the size, these are adult sizes. They represent parallel evolution to different systems. These systems happen to be the red dots on the volcanic zone of Iceland. So there are springs here that are groundwater coming off from the porous volcanic bedrock. And here's Mývatn, for example, with caves. Very exciting. We have a special project there. And then Þingvallavatn, of course, is a spring. It's the largest spring on Earth, one of the largest springs on Earth. And what they found basically, was that this parallel evolution demonstrated really natural selection, because it was parallel evolution of almost very similar phenotypes in each of these springs, some of them very small. Some of these populations may be only 50 fish, but they are independently evolved in each case. So that would definitely be an example of eco-evo process. But let's then open up the conversation a little bit and move on and realize that the statement I made in my first slide about the ecosystem significance of biodiversity is very strong. And in this case, I'm drawing your attention to the fact that the ecosystem of Þingvallavatn, as an example here, you notice how they are eating different things. These are the different morphs that I introduced earlier. They are basically controlling how the system works. And ecosystem function is essential for life on Earth. It produces, it is about productivity, it is about oxygen production, it's about flow of energy in nature, and so forth. So ecosystem function needs to be, and ecosystem health needs to be conserved. And there has been growing evidence that within species diversity like this, and also individual diversity, is even more responsible for ecosystem function. If you look at this graph here by Desrosiers et al., a meta-analysis, equally, this is intraspecific effects and species effects. So the intraspecific within species diversity is having at least similar or sometimes greater effect on ecosystem function and ecosystem health, we can say, than between species. Of course, between species diversity is very important as well. So this is just to sort of compare with the problem. If you only focus on species numbers, then you are ignoring this within species diversity. And mind you, populations are becoming extinct on Earth much faster than species, mostly because people ignore them, because that's not part of the current policy. So I will conclude my presentation with a little bit of a dive into the developmental systems, because ultimately what we need to be able to work with is how does the phenotypic diversity actually emerge? And obviously, I've been saying before, it's definitely not a genetic blueprint. It is an interactive process, which I refer to here as, and many people others do, as a developmental system. I just selectively take the skull. And here we're looking at adult fish, char from Þingvallavatn, this piscivore pointed snout, typical predator-looking fish, whereas this one has this blunt snout, short lower jaw, which is a benthivore, eating snails on the bottom, actually. Both of these fish are about 30 centimeters long. But we've been doing a lot of research on this, and here I'm unable to tell you about all that research. And therefore, I'm not citing many publications here. but I'm just drawing your attention maybe to a few. But the thing is that what we know is that these differences in the head are actually constructed during embryonic development, which is very roughly presented here. This is an egg, about 4 millimeters to 5. This is an embryo that hatched from the egg, about 2 centimeters long, and then maybe 2.5 centimeters long. Juvenile fish, you see the differences here coming from different sized eggs, which are then starting to feed. And this is the head of a first feeding juvenile, about 2.5 centimeters long. And just pay attention to the fact how much it looks like this, similarities. This is what we would then say the adult has evolved to keep or retain the retention of juvenile characteristics. It's called pedomorphosis. It's like us humans. We look like embryos of orangutans. And Darwin actually had a picture of this in his book, Descent of Man. So this kind of evolutionary process is well documented. But what our research has found also, among many other things on this, is that the reason why this happens developmentally for the individual is the timing of ossification of bones. So the reddish color here on this, what we call cleared and stained embryo, it's actually the same fish here. The blue is cartilage and the red is bone or calcium. And so the more calcium is formed earlier in the embryo, and this is related to gene activation by various factors, the more likely the morphology is to become like this. So you can see that what produces this, of course, is some genetic material, plasticity, and various other things, size of eggs, and God knows what. It's a very broad, interactive, systemic process that brings this to happen. And that sort of was an introduction to say that this slide includes a lot of words, but it is basically the same head, just convincing you, hopefully, how much is going on here, systemic, in terms of systems and processes. And we are looking at, we can look at it through the lens of gene expression that is involved in producing this cartilage and ossification processes in this head, which is influenced by the diet. Remember the plasticity discussion before? It's influenced by temperature. It's influenced by skeletal movements. That is to say, embryo is breathing through the mouth and then it's moving its mouth. And that influences and motivates certain gene that produces calcium. So what we're looking at then is a complex biochemical or cellular processes involving DNA, RNA, and protein production and various other processes. And also it is involving factors that we call epigenetic factors on the DNA, which are related to this non-genetic inheritance, epigenetic inheritance that I talked about before. So I'm sort of drawing attention to that a little bit. And of course, as biosemiotics would emphasize, it's an interactive or transactive system of science, because these decisions, if you like, by the bone to produce calcium is clearly based on recognition of some signals, like from the environment, or from the inner environment or the outer environment. And what it is not, obviously, is one directional gene action. That's the point I really want to make. And it is maybe here that I want to mention that I would have liked to throw in millions of references from students and the colleagues, but I can only come to me afterwards and ask for these references for this research. And it also connects with research being done on other species of fish, like cichlids, for example. But just visualize before I leave this slide, that if we then have a disturbance in the environment, climate change, ocean acidification, obviously this is happening in freshwater, but we can just visualize this, or pollution or something that is disturbing biodiversity. Then you can just imagine how these signals are going to affect this. Like if you warm water up, fish will need to breathe faster. That means that maybe the morphology of this embryo will change. So these are the types of things we need to think about when we think of processes for the generation of biodiversity. Here, just looking at individuals. And then that individual will become a part of a population that will be selected for the next generation through natural selection. So this kind of culminates in this slide that I basically dedicate to the famous geneticist and developmental biologist Conrad Waddington, Scottish guy, that was way ahead of his time in the middle of the 20th century, developing what I call here a systems process approach to development. And because Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead has been mentioned here, and Ole Sandberg mentioned his process philosophy. Waddington read Whitehead, and he was basing his approach quite a bit on ideas from Whitehead. Whitehead actually used biology very much in his thinking. So let's start here. Let's start at the beginning. We all know that developmental systems maintain a great deal of stability. When I develop, for example, as an individual from an egg to what I'm now, I'm not changing into a frog. I'm becoming somewhat similar to you. Like I'm actually a human being and that is stability of development. Anything else would be meaningless. So we can call that flow. So imagine the development of the individual then as a flow thing. But of course, there are also all sorts of opportunities in this process for novelties to be created. Longer nose or longer ears or whatever, humans. We can call that flux. It's a bit of a less predictable, definitely not predictable situation. Plasticity, of course, is often related to flux. So Conrad Waddington referred to this process of developmental stability as canalization. He also used the word homeoresis, which is even more descriptive here, more appropriate, in my opinion. Because homeo, of course, refers to stability, but resis refers to flow instead of homeostasis, which is often used in biology and sort of is maybe more favoring the static view. And then Waddington developed this what he called epigenetic landscape to explain this idea that here is imagine here a fertilized cell, zygote here, and then what happens is the development of the embryo and into the adult. And what happens is that this cell, it has, of course, all cells have the same DNA, mind you. It is responding to developmental conditions at any given time and the environmental, internal and external environmental factors and genetic factors that are operating at each time. So that is the context of the development for this cell. And it changes into different limbs and organs and also according to what the temperature is and such things. And that is what he called the epigenetic landscape. So this contextual reality is reflected in this hilly valley landscape. You can see this cell rolling down. So he wrote that when a developing system is disturbed, it returns not to the state it was at when the disturbance occurred, but to some later part of the stabilizing pathway of change. Notice what he's saying. The development is responding to things coming towards it. It's obviously not being produced by some predetermined genetic basis or something like that. And that, he would claim, gives rise to a developing system that he calls the epigenetic landscape. So this is, of course, a totally opposite view of development than is most often discussed, where development is considered an unfolding of something. Unfolding of something means that it is predetermined somehow. And theories of that kind have been floating around in human culture for centuries and are now being represented in theories of gene programs and genetic blueprints and such things. And this rhymes very well with another famous geneticist, Richard Lewontin, where he says basically evolution, now we're talking about evolution, is not an unfolding, but a historically contingent wandering pathway to the space of possibilities. Notice the resemblance to the epigenetic landscape concept. And, what Richard Lewontin is here now talking about evolution of life, of course, evolution of diversity. It's based on largely on selection of these developmental systems that we've been talking about. So another evidence then for this, there's a lot of literature here and sometimes difficult to control oneself when you get into this. But I want to draw your attention again to the idea of this developmental, this evolutionary continuum of divergence. In this case, it's sort of the opposite here. If you go to the left here of this picture, you see that I'm basically saying that if you see my cursor, you're going from little divergence to great divergence, like the model I showed you before of the divergence of the char. But here, Kevin Parsons and colleagues have actually combined this in several different species of organisms. Here up is cichlids. Here we have sticklebacks, char actually from Þingvallavatn, and then cichlids again. And so it's basically a parallel situation. And on the left, we have what would be looking more like the planktivore or the piscivore morphology of the embryos and the adults actually here. And here we would have more the benthic morphology, or you can see it very clearly here. But the continuum is, the point is that this plasticity that is occurring early is resulting in very similar developmental responses of the system as it is here when we have adaptive radiation. These are different species. Notice these are not plastic morphologies. These are reproductively isolated species, and this is something in between, like this charring thing. I hope you get my point. The point is that it is the developmental system that is responding in a similar way, in a parallel way, to very different stimuli, like directly from the environment when it's plasticity, and then more to inheritable elements like genes when you're in the middle. And finally, it is being completely based on specialization. But it is the same kind of reaction, which, of course, Sultan et al. Would say explains agency. That's the only way really to deal with this if one wants to get to the bottom of this question. And then this is also my way of making the statement that, and it also rhymes with Sultan et al.'s definition of biological agency, that what I call developmental systems creating this phenotypic variation, which is so important for evolution, is completely combined with the ecosystem, with the concept of ecosystem. And they just use a global term called biological systems. So that's maybe how I should have framed it. But so this is all connected, notice. And all these changes here have an adaptive, are of an adaptive nature. So when it comes to, and now I'm almost finished. I just want to then go back and remind you, or hope remind you of how we think about biodiversity now. But I hope I have convinced you that it is important to take ecological evolution and developmental significance into account when thinking about biodiversity and its processes. But then remind us that static categorical measures and simplified counts are unfortunately dominating. So how do we then deal with this in terms of management and conservation? Well, I just cite Ole Martin Sandberg's example of the storm that some of you may remember. We don't conserve the storm, which is a process. We may be able to, and now we can think of the storm as species evolution or development of the phenotype of an individual. We don't preserve it as such. We cannot look at it in a static way, but we can work with the conditions, the context of difference and contrast that support these processes. So here is some leading sentence towards how we then could work with this to rectify human behavior. And very quickly, this has been exemplified, for example, in this publication, where it is here on the left, you see the yellow proposal here, and we are looking at proposal towards mitigation and policy development. That what the authors here are proposing is to really take the phenotypic construction and intraspecific diversity, phenotypic diversity into account, whereas the conventional view here doesn't do it, it just counts things. And finally, just to remind you of the BIODICE website and what we are doing. There are over 200 people now registered for this network, and we are looking towards a bright future of what we want to achieve. It's been operating now for almost a year, and this network, of course, is focused on research and then transfer of knowledge on biodiversity through education and for education and policy, but not the least also capacity building by combining institutions and individuals, institutions in Iceland and international collaborations to really elevate the recognition of the significance of biodiversity, for example, in relation to climate change, and to present Iceland as a case study. I would like to mention, for historic reasons, that this whole thing started through a very important workshop that we had with European Molecular Biology Laboratory, EMBL, about a year ago. and we welcome that relationship very much. And here is the website with the manifesto and a way to sign up to BIODICE. Everybody is welcome. And with that, I want to thank you. And with this sort of picture of scientists and char in this cave system in Mývatn working together. And thank you for your attention. This is actually work which is that is illustrated in this slide, which is led by Camille Leblanc, Hólar University. And it's very difficult for me to really put in full-scale acknowledgements, but I want to mention the names of people that are most directly working with me on this particular research projects, mostly, which is at the museum, first of all, and Hólar University, and then of the University of Iceland. And then I want to specifically mention a colleague and a friend from Canada, Stephen Cronshaw, who, in addition to a number of international collaborators that I would really like to be able to list here, have really made this work happen and clarified my thinking and the thinking of others that we work together on these important topics. And I don't have a slide to support what I say now, but I just want to say that I'm under influence of the fact that a very important man died recently in Iceland, Arthur Garðarsson, so professor of zoology, that taught us a lot here, and I maybe want to just dedicate this presentation to his memory. He influenced many of us, and we miss him a lot. Thank you very much.